When I first moved into that old 152-year-old mansion at the end of Willow Creek Drive, the last thing I expected was trouble. In fact, the whole point of buying the place, if you can call a $1 transaction a purchase, was to downshift into the quiet, peaceful kind of life most people imagine when they picture retirement. I'd spent nearly 3 decades as an Air Force mechanic, the kind of job that teaches you 2 things: how to fix just about anything, and how to appreciate silence when it finally shows up. That mansion promised both. Every morning during those first few weeks, I woke to the same simple comforts. The soft rhythmic click-click-click of neighborhood sprinklers, the warm scent of coffee drifting from my old percolator, and the view of the massive oak tree in my front yard stretching its branches across the rising sun like someone waking from a long nap. The mansion itself was a little worn down. Okay, maybe more than a little, but it had character. Thick wooden beams, wide porches, tall windows that looked out over the cul-de-sac like watchful eyes. Every board creaked with age, but in the same comforting way an old dog sighs when it settles into its bed. The neighborhood was exactly the kind of place where time slowed down just enough to notice things. Mr. Parsons walking his schnauzer while reading yesterday's newspaper. The bakers decorating for holidays that hadn't even happened yet. Mrs. Leary sweeping her porch like she was preparing for an inspection from the Queen herself. It was peaceful in a predictable, suburban way, and I loved it. After spending years surrounded by the metal and fuel chaos of military life, the idea of restoring a historic mansion in a quiet neighborhood felt like the kind of odd dream you never expect to come true. The $1 purchase was part of a county historical preservation program, a little-known initiative encouraging people to restore neglected properties instead of letting them rot into the ground. The program required you to commit to renovating the property within a certain number of years, but that was fine by me. I'd always been good with my hands, and I wasn't afraid of a challenge. Besides, the idea of breathing life back into a place that had stood longer than my entire family line appealed to something sentimental in me. For a short while, life was stable, quiet, and comfortably mundane. I spent my mornings sanding down porch railings and afternoons pulling old nails from floorboards. Contractors came and went, each of them whistling at the mansion's craftsmanship. "They don't build 'em like this anymore," they'd say. I'd nod, beam with a little pride, and promise to keep the place as original as possible. The first sign of trouble came on a Wednesday morning. I remember because I had just finished my coffee and stepped outside to check the mail. I wasn't expecting anything. Maybe a coupon booklet or a dentist reminder. But there it was. A crisp white envelope with bold red letters at the top. Homeowners Association Violation Notice. First I laughed. It had to be a mistake. My property wasn't part of any HOA. Something I had triple-checked before signing anything. Not only was the mansion older than the entire neighborhood surrounding it, but it also sat just outside the official HOA boundary line. I'd even joked with the county clerk about it when I filed my transfer of ownership. Still, I opened the letter. Inside was a detailed list of violations, each one more ridiculous than the last. Unapproved exterior modifications. Excessive construction debris visible from public street. Unregistered contractor activity. At the bottom, in bold, it read, "This is your first warning." I stared at the page for a good 30 seconds, wondering if someone was pulling a prank. Maybe the bakers were trying out a new neighborhood welcome tradition. Or maybe Mr. Parsons finally got bored of walking his dog and decided to entertain himself. But when I reached the porch steps and saw her, clipboard in hand, arms crossed, lips pursed so tightly they could cut through steel, I realized it wasn't a prank. This was my first real encounter with Karen. Not a Karen. Not a casual, part-time, seasonal Karen. No, this was the full-time HOA President Karen, equipped with a level of suburban authority that could only be described as self-awarded. She stood at the edge of my driveway like she was overseeing a crime scene. When she saw me reading the letter, she lifted her chin, as if she were unveiling the Mona Lisa. "Good morning," she said in the tone of someone who doesn't mean good or morning. "I trust you've received the notice?" I held up the paper. "I have, but I'm not in the HOA." Karen blinked, unfazed. "All properties on Willow Creek Drive are under my jurisdiction." "Your jurisdiction?" I echoed. She nodded solemnly. "The mansion has always been considered part of our community standards. spiritually if not formally. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Not because she was rude, but because she was so confident in her invented authority that it felt almost cruel to correct her. "Look," I said, pulling out a folder I'd been keeping handy. The one with the deed, the plat map, the county certificate, and a highlighted section clearly stating, "Not part of HOA. I appreciate your concern, but I'm not under HOA rules." Karen squinted at the papers like they were written in ancient runes. After a few seconds, she sniffed, flicked her clipboard, and said, "Paperwork can be misinterpreted." "Not this paperwork," I replied. She narrowed her eyes in a way that told me the conversation was over, but the war had just begun. Karen turned on her heel, marched down my driveway, and disappeared behind the hedges, her posture stiff with purpose. I thought that was the end of it. I thought maybe she'd go back to patrolling lawns for illegal sprinkler angles or mailbox infractions. But when I checked my mailbox again that evening, there was a second envelope. Another violation. Then the next morning, 2 more. And by the end of the week, I'd received a stack thick enough to use as a doorstop. But it was the last letter, the one slipped under my door at dawn, that stopped me cold. Failure to comply may result in HOA enforcement action. The kicker? At the bottom, handwritten in bold, swirling, furious script. "This is your final warning." Except, of course, I never got a first warning. And this was the moment I realized that letter changed everything. If I had known the second letter was the start of what the neighbors would later call the Great Willow Creek Breakdown, I might have taken a picture of it for posterity, maybe framed it, but at the time it just felt like an annoying follow-up to an already ridiculous mistake. And yet, as the days went by, the letters didn't slow down. They multiplied, they evolved, they got personal, and it became very clear that Karen wasn't simply confused. She had declared a petty suburban war. The first escalation happened the morning after the final warning. I was sanding the front porch railings, minding my own business, when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone clearing their throat with theatrical intensity. I turned around and there she was again, Karen, flanked by 2 men who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. One carried a binder thicker than a phone book. The other clutched a styrofoam cup of HOA-branded coffee like it was his emotional support beverage. "Good morning," Karen said, though her tone suggested she wished my morning were significantly worse. "We need to discuss your repeated non-compliance." I set down my sander. "Again, I'm not in the HOA." Her smile sharpened. "We've reviewed the situation and decided that your property is," she made air quotes, "emotionally integral to the neighborhood. Therefore, it is subject to community standards." One of the men softly muttered, "We didn't vote on that." But Karen shot him a look so piercing he instantly quieted. She began flipping through her binder. "Violation. Your contractor's truck blocked the aesthetic sightline from the cul-de-sac. Violation. Your tarp is an unofficial shade of blue. Violation. Your paint sample constitutes unauthorized exterior modification." I blinked. "It's a sample. On a board. Leaning against the wall. Still visible," Karen replied triumphantly, as if she'd uncovered tax fraud. The contractors, who had been carrying lumber from their truck, paused just long enough to give me a sympathetic nod. They'd seen this kind of thing before. Contractors always do. HOAs, property line disputes, neighbors who believe ordinances are divine commandments. But even they seemed surprised by Karen's fervor. "Look," I said calmly, wiping dust from my hands. "I don't mean to be rude, but I have documents. From the county. From the historical program. From the land registry." Karen waved her hand. "Paperwork isn't everything." "In this case," I replied, "it's exactly everything." Her jaw tightened. She snapped her binder shut. "We'll be following up." And follow up she did. By the end of the week, I'd received a flyer announcing a neighborhood emergency meeting. It featured a blurry photo of my mansion's exterior mid-renovation, complete with red arrows pointing to various infractions. Someone had even added a dramatic, slanted title, "Community Under Threat." I decided to attend. Not because I was intimidated, but because sometimes the quickest way to stop a rumor is to look it in the eye. The meeting took place in the community center, a beige room with flickering fluorescent lights and a table full of sad-looking donut holes. The moment I walked in, conversation stalled. People whispered. Some nodded politely but nervously, as if greeting someone who had recently been featured on the local news for questionable behavior. Karen was already at the front of the room, her laptop connected to a projector. She looked like she'd been waiting her entire life for this moment. "Thank you for coming," she said with the enthusiasm of a kindergarten teacher introducing the letter A. "We're here to discuss a growing concern." She clicked to the next slide. A zoomed-in photo of my porch with a tarp fluttering in the wind. "Aesthetic inconsistency," she announced dramatically. Click. A picture of the contractor's truck. "Unregistered commercial intrusion." Click. A blurry zoom of me carrying a ladder. "Unauthorized labor." The room murmured, but not in the way she wanted. Several neighbors exchanged looks that said, "Is she serious?" One elderly man raised his hand. "Karen," he said, "isn't that house outside the HOA?" Karen stiffened. "It has always been part of our community legacy. It's older than the HOA," someone else whispered loudly. "And his deed says, paperwork is manipulable," she snapped, causing even her allies to blink. Then she unveiled her masterpiece. A hand-sketched map taped to a foam board, drawn with what looked suspiciously like scented markers. She used a pointer to circle the mansion dramatically. "This," she declared, "is my son's rightful estate. He has always planned to live there someday." A ripple of confusion spread across the room. Someone murmured, "Does her son even live here?" Another whispered, "I thought he moved to Arizona." Someone else, "I heard Colorado." Karen heard nothing. She was too busy basking in the imaginary glow of her own righteousness. I raised my hand. "Just to clarify," I said gently, "I legally purchased the property from the county through a documented historical program. And your son has no." Karen slammed her pointer on the board so hard it bounced. "Your presence threatens our neighborhood stability." I opened my mouth to respond, but she steamrolled ahead. "We must act decisively. We cannot allow unregulated chaos." From the back of the room, a voice whispered, "It's a paint sample." Another, "Does she hear herself?" But Karen wasn't done. She ended the meeting with a flourish, passing out informational packets that contained copies of the violation letters she'd sent me, complete with angry handwritten notes in the margins like dangerous and non-compliant behavior. As I left, 3 neighbors caught up to me outside. They looked embarrassed. "Sorry about that," one said. "Karen gets enthusiastic. Don't let her bully you," another added. "She once fined me because my Christmas lights were emitting a rebellious glow," the third whispered. I chuckled, reassured that not everyone had drunk the HOA Kool-Aid. Still, the meeting had put one thing into sharp focus. This wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. This was a full-blown crusade. Over the next few days, the petty war intensified. One morning, I found a neon orange sticker slapped on my contractor's ladder. "Equipment in violation of community order. Remove immediately." The contractors laughed so hard they nearly dropped their tools. Another day, Karen stood on the sidewalk scribbling in her notebook every time a speck of dust floated off my porch. Then came the online post. The HOA's official website posted a notice for all to see. "Unapproved occupant of abandoned property. Community alert. Abandoned property. Unapproved occupant." They'd publicly called me a squatter. I sat at my dining table staring at the screen while the afternoon light filtered through the dusty window panes. I wondered if I should be angry. I wondered if I should call a lawyer. But the strongest emotion I felt was disbelief, tinged with amusement. She had no idea who she was messing with, because I'd spent years working on machinery that could fall out of the sky if someone didn't double-check every bolt. I lived by precision, paperwork, accuracy, and I had all 3 on my side. It was at that moment, staring at that absurd accusation, that I realized something had shifted. They weren't just pestering me. They were escalating. And unintentionally, spectacularly, they'd just given me the exact leverage I needed. I leaned back in my chair, cracked a small smile, and whispered. That was the moment everything shifted. By the time the third week rolled around, the HOA letters had become such a normal part of my mail that I started sorting them automatically into a special pile I labeled Karen's Greatest Hits. I didn't open them anymore. Didn't need to. I already knew what they said. They were all variations of the same theme. Outrage sprinkled with entitlement, sealed in envelopes purchased in bulk. But something in me had shifted. The irritation had burned off, replaced by the steady, calm focus I used to feel in the Air Force whenever a complicated repair landed on my desk. I wasn't angry anymore. I was intrigued. The HOA thought they were building a case against me. But what they were really doing, without realizing it, was giving me motivation to dig deeper. And so, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I drove myself down to the county records office. The building was a squat, tan brick rectangle with windows that hadn't been washed since the early 90s. Inside, it smelled like old paper and lukewarm coffee. A single ceiling fan clicked overhead, spinning so slowly it was mostly for decoration. Behind the main counter sat Teresa, the clerk with the permanently unimpressed expression. She squinted at me over her reading glasses. "You again?" she asked. "Afraid so," I replied, placing my folder on the counter. "I need to look at the boundary records again. And maybe the archival ones." She raised a brow. "The deep archives?" "Yep." Teresa slowly pushed her glasses up. "That bad, huh?" "You have no idea." With a sigh that said she'd been dealing with county drama for 23 years and had seen every possible flavor of ridiculous, she led me into the back. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls in towering rows. Felt like walking into the brain of an old librarian. Teresa flipped through drawer after drawer until she pulled out a thick, yellowed folder labeled Willow Creek Historic Parcel Division, 1860 to 1952. She slapped it on a desk. "Knock yourself out." I sat down and opened the folder. And there it was, the key I hadn't even known I was searching for. The maps were hand-drawn, full of scribbles, notes, and stamps from decades of revisions. But one thing remained consistent. A thin strip of land behind the mansion, stretching across what was now the HOA's private park. A strip of land with my parcel number on it. I blinked, then blinked again. "Is this right?" I asked Teresa. She leaned over, peered at the map, then let out a soft laugh. "Oh yeah, this little mistake pops up every few years. The HOA always tries to claim that land. County denies it every time. And nobody fixes the database?" She shrugged. "Not my department." I stared at the map, the weight of its implications settling over me slowly. Not only did I own the mansion, I owned the entire park behind it. The swings, the benches, the picnic table, the walking path, the flower beds Karen insisted were community bonding assets. All of it was mine. "Well," I said quietly, "that's interesting." "Interesting," Teresa repeated dryly, "is one way to put it." I photocopied every relevant page, slid them into my folder, thanked Teresa with a sincerity she rarely heard, and walked out into the sunlight with a new sense of direction. Not vengeance, not spite, just clarity. The HOA wanted a line in the sand? Fine. I was going to give them one. Back home, I spread everything across my dining table: maps, deeds, surveys, letters, historical claims dating all the way back to Civil War-era property splits. And the more I read, the more the pieces settled into place like a puzzle that had been waiting decades for someone to pay attention. By evening, the plan formed itself. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't confrontational. It didn't involve yelling or slamming doors or demanding apologies. It was paperwork. Clean, boring, devastating paperwork. All I needed to do was file the proper property use notice. A document so simple most people never even read it. But in this case, it would trigger a chain reaction Karen could never have predicted. Before filing, though, I decided to give her one last chance to see reason, if only for the comedy of it. The next morning, I installed a single polite sign on the edge of the park. Nothing flashy, nothing aggressive. Private property. Authorized access by owner only. 4 questions. Contact county office. As I hammered the last nail into the post, I felt the temperature shift. Not the weather, the atmosphere. There's a certain electric tension that fills the air right before a storm. Or, apparently, right before an HOA president sees something she doesn't like. I turned slowly. There she was, Karen, marching down the sidewalk with hair bouncing, arms pumping, and fury radiating off her like heat waves on asphalt. She reached the sign and let out a screech that triggered a flock of birds overhead. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "Installing a sign," I replied calmly. "This is our park." "No," I said, tapping the deed in my hand. "It's mine." Karen blinked. Once, twice. Her face shifted from confusion to disbelief to rage in a matter of seconds. "That land belongs to the community. To my son." I handed her a copy of the 1860 parcel map. She stared at it like it was written in ancient hieroglyphics. "This can't be right," she snapped. "Take it up with the county. That paperwork is wrong." "It's older than you are," I said. For a moment, Karen stood completely still. A dangerous stillness. Then she turned sharply on her heel and screamed down the sidewalk. "This isn't over." I smiled. I figured, because as far as I was concerned, it had just begun. That afternoon, I filed the property use notice. And the next morning, the first emails began arriving in the HOA inbox. Then the letters. Then the confirmations. And then, my personal favorite, the automated county warning informing the HOA that they were occupying private land without a legal easement. Rumors spread like wildfire. Neighbors whispered on their lawns. Kids pointed at the sign. Older residents walked by shaking their heads, muttering things like, "Finally," and "long time coming." Karen, however, reacted exactly as expected, with complete, unrestrained meltdown energy. She doubled her patrols, scribbled in her clipboard like she was writing a manifesto, delivered fresh violation letters with the determination of a door-to-door missionary. But what she didn't realize, the part she couldn't see through her haze of rage, was that every frantic move she made only pushed her deeper into the quicksand she had created. The plan was working, and she had no idea what was coming next. That night, as I sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the fields, I felt a calm satisfaction settle over me. Not because I wanted a war, but because I had drawn my line, and she had stepped right over it. This time, I was ready. This time, I had the upper hand. And this time, the storm wasn't coming for me. It was coming for her. It happened on a Saturday morning, the kind of morning where the sun shines a little too brightly, as if it knows something dramatic is about to unfold. I was on the front porch tightening a loose railing bracket when I heard frantic footsteps slapping against the pavement. At first, I thought a kid was running late for soccer practice. Then I heard the voice, sharp, high-pitched, powered by raw indignation. "There he is. Officers. That's him." I didn't even need to look up to know it was Karen. She came storming up my driveway with the kind of energy usually reserved for reality show confrontations. And behind her, moving with the exhausted gait of men who clearly didn't want to be involved, were 2 uniformed police officers. One of them made eye contact with me. His expression said, "Please tell me this isn't what it looks like." The other muttered under his breath in a tone that suggested he'd already guessed the answer. Karen pointed dramatically at my face like she was identifying a fugitive. "Arrest him for trespassing on my son's estate." The officers exchanged a slow, pained look. I wiped my hands on a rag. "Good morning, gentlemen. Can I help you?" Karen's expression twisted. "He's mocking law enforcement. Add that to the report." The taller officer sighed. "Ma'am, we haven't filed any report." "You will," she snapped. "He is illegally occupying property that belongs to my son." "Ma'am," the officer said in the voice of a man who had already spent his morning wrestling with nonsense. "We checked the county records. This gentleman owns the mansion." Karen gasped like the police had betrayed her personally. "That paperwork is wrong. Spiritually, this land belongs to my son. His great-uncle once admired the house when he drove past it on a road trip. The shorter officer pinched the bridge of his nose. "Ma'am, that's not how property law works. It's how legacy works," she retorted. I almost admired her commitment to delusion. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the unmistakable sound of HOA conflict reaching volcanic levels. Mr. Parsons stopped mid-dog walk. The Bakers stood frozen on their lawn, holding a yard decoration shaped like a patriotic eagle. A few others gathered on the sidewalk with the same entertainment-hungry look you usually see when someone's grilling something interesting. Karen spun toward the crowd. "Witnesses. Good. The community must see what he's doing." The officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we already told you. This man hasn't broken any laws. You cannot call us to remove someone from their own property. He's ruining our park," she shrieked. At that, I raised an eyebrow. "Your park?" Karen turned back to me with such fury it ruffled the curls in her hair. "Yes, the community park." I clicked my tongue. "About that." She narrowed her eyes. "What?" But before I could answer, chaos found a new gear. Because that was the moment her reinforcements arrived. 3 HOA board members came speed power walking down the street like a middle-aged Justice League. One carried a camcorder straight out of 2006. Another held a folder full of highlighted complaints. The third clutched a latte like he'd been dragged along unwillingly. "Karen?" The man with the camcorder asked nervously. "Are we sure about this?" She snarled, "Record everything." He obeyed, though the camera wasn't even turned on. The shorter officer tried reasoning one last time. "Ma'am, unless you have proof he's trespassing." "Proof?" she thundered. "This entire community is the proof." Someone in the crowd whispered, "She's finally lost it." Someone else whispered, "Finally." The officers took my ID, checked their system one more time, and then returned it with an apologetic shrug. "Sir, you're all good. Sorry for the inconvenience." "No problem," I said. "I know you don't choose the calls." Karen's mouth dropped open so wide you could have stored winter coats in it. "You are ignoring the rightful heir." "Ma'am," the tall officer said gently. "Your son lives in Colorado. He could move back," she snapped. "He doesn't want to," someone in the crowd murmured, and I had to look away before I laughed. The officers left after advising Karen not to abuse emergency lines. She tried to follow them, screaming about neighborhood stability and spiritual property rights, but they rolled up their windows at exactly the right moment. The crowd began to disperse, whispering the kind of gossip that fuels suburban ecosystems for months. But Karen wasn't done. Not even close, because 15 minutes later, she returned. This time with a clipboard, a camera crew that clearly wasn't an actual news station, and a fury that could have powered a small generator. "This community will know the truth," she barked. The cameraman, who wore a shirt that said local news-ish, looked uncertain. "Ma'am, you said there was a crisis?" "There is," she hissed. "He is stealing our park." The news guy turned to me. "Sir, any comment?" I smiled politely. "Sure. I own that park." Karen screamed. Actually screamed. "You do not," she yelled. "Your fraudulent documents. They came from the county," I reminded her. "Frauds can happen anywhere," she snapped. The faux reporter slowly backed away, clearly deciding this wasn't worth whatever she'd promised him. He whispered to his cameraman, "Let's go. This isn't news. This is something else." Karen tried to chase them, but her heels caught a crack in the sidewalk and she stumbled. Not enough to fall, just enough to make everyone watching suck in a breath. She recovered, straightened her shirt, and shouted, "I will not be ignored." Then she pointed at me with a trembling finger. "This is war." Her board members, sufficiently mortified, began quietly distancing themselves. That's when the certified letter arrived. My mail carrier, a guy named Luis with a sense of timing so impeccable, I'm convinced he's psychic, handed it to me with a sympathetic wince. "You might want to sit down before reading that," he said. I opened the envelope right on the porch. And there it was. A full-page demand from the HOA. You are hereby ordered to vacate community property immediately. Community property. Vacate. They truly believed they had the power to evict me from my own land. And right at that peak of pure ridiculous tension, I've got to ask, have you ever dealt with an HOA like this? Drop your story in the comments, hit subscribe if you love poetic justice, and let's see how many of us have survived HOA brutality. I folded the letter slowly, calmly, savoring every second of the absurdity. Because unlike Karen, I knew something she didn't. They weren't just wrong. They had just made their biggest, most expensive mistake yet. And when the truth landed, it was going to hit them harder than any violation notice ever could. I tucked the letter into my pocket and smiled. This, I whispered to myself, is where the real fun begins. And I meant it. When I tucked that eviction letter into my pocket, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. Not yell. Not argue. Not march down the street demanding apologies. No, none of that ever works with people like Karen. She thrived on drama the way tomato plants thrive on sunlight. The louder you were, the stronger she grew. No, the key was something much simpler. Something infinitely more effective. Something she never, not in all her clipboard-wielding, Bilo-worshipping life, would expect. Paperwork. Real paperwork. The kind backed by county offices, property records, legal boundaries, and the quiet force of reality. I began by making a single phone call. Not to a lawyer, not to the sheriff, not to the HOA hotline Karen probably believed she personally controlled. I called the same county clerk who had processed my deed months earlier. A woman named Teresa. Calm voice, short sentences, the no-nonsense attitude of someone who has filed more boundary disputes than a divorce court judge. When I explained what the HOA had sent me, she actually laughed. "Oh Lord," she said, tapping on her keyboard. "Yep, still shows you own the mansion. And the strip behind it?" I asked casually. She clicked a few more times. "Yep, entire section, park and all." I smiled. "Can you send me the formal property use advisory packet?" "You bet," she said. "And just so you know, your HOA has tried disputing this twice. We denied both. That was all I needed." Within an hour, I had a neat folder full of every relevant document. Boundary maps, ownership certificates, restoration permits, and property use guidelines signed by the county. And at the very top, the most important page. The one outlining the liability responsibilities of anyone using private land without permission. It was time. I walked to the little park behind my house. The one with the worn playground equipment, the crooked picnic table, and the faded HOA property. Residents only sign Karen had proudly hammered into the soil years ago. Except now that sign sat on my land like a squat trespass notice written by people who didn't own a single blade of grass beneath it. I took photos from every angle. Then I printed them. Then I tucked them into the folder. The HOA board meeting that evening was supposedly private. But when you schedule a meeting in the community center and leave the blinds open and the door cracked, it's not very private at all. I stepped inside at precisely 7:03 p.m., carrying my folder tucked under one arm. The moment Karen saw me, she stiffened. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "Attending the meeting," I replied plainly. "This is for HOA members only." "I know," I said. "That's why I brought this." I placed the folder gently on the folding table, right on top of her massive binder of grievances. She looked down at it like I'd placed a bomb next to her planner. "What is this?" she asked. "The solution," I said, folding my hands. The board members exchanged wary glances. Even the one holding a latte looked nervous. I opened the folder and spread out the documents like a dealer presenting winning cards. "This," I said, pointing to the first map, "is the deed to my property, including the land behind the mansion." "That is not your land," Karen snapped, slapping her palm on the table. "It's our park. We've used it for years." "I know," I said with a sympathetic nod. "But using land you don't own doesn't transfer ownership. That's not how anything works." The man with the latte leaned in, eyes scanning the papers. "Karen, this says the county denied our claim twice." Karen snatched the page away from him. The county is wrong. Then I slid forward the final document, the one outlining liability and rental requirements for use of private land. This, I said quietly, is notice that the HOA has been using my land illegally for years. Silence. Real silence. The kind that settles into a room like fog. I took a breath. So you have two choices. Remove all park equipment within 30 days. Swings, benches, sign and all, or pay monthly rent. Rumbling erupted across the room. It wasn't anger at me. It was aimed squarely, spectacularly at Karen. Several board members turned toward her at once. You said we owned the park. You said the land was grandfathered in. You told us the county was wrong. You told us your son had future rights. One of them added, bewildered. Karen's face drained of color. It is ours. Spiritually. I shook my head. Legally beats spiritually. The latte-holding board member rubbed his forehead. How much rent are we talking? I slid over the calculation page. Fair market value for utility easement, recreational use, and liability transfer. Comes out to a modest rate. One board member let out a whistle. Another slapped the table and muttered, I knew this would come back to bite us. Karen grabbed one of the papers and waved it around like a flag. We don't have to pay him anything. We can fight this. Karen, the board president, other than her, said quietly, we don't have the budget to fight a losing legal battle. We could remove the equipment, someone said. No. Another neighbor protested. My grandkids play here. You did this. Another accused Karen. Voices rose. Fingers pointed. Chair legs screeched on the floor. The HOA was unraveling like a cheap sweater. I simply stood there watching the meltdown unfold. Finally, the board president, tired eyes, defeated posture, lifted a hand. All in favor of paying the rent. Raise your hands. Hands shot up across the room. All except one. Karen's. She sat rigid, fists balled in pure suburban fury. You're all betraying our community standards, she whispered harshly. No, the president said. We're saving our community from your mistakes. She stood abruptly, knocking over her folding chair. I resign, she shouted. No objections, someone muttered. Karen stormed out of the meeting hall like she was fleeing a burning building, though the only thing burning was her pride. Her departure was punctuated by the door slamming open, closed, then open again when her cardigan got caught, then closed a second time with less force. Once she was gone, the room relaxed. The president turned to me. We're sorry for all this. I shrugged. It happens. I just want to restore my home in peace. And you will, he said firmly. Starting now. He signed the rental agreement that evening. By the time I walked home under the streetlights, the weight of the last few weeks finally loosened its grip. Not because I'd won, but because the chaos had reached its poetic, inevitable conclusion. The next morning, I found something unexpected taped to my door. A handwritten note. It wasn't a complaint, or a warning, or anything in bold red letters. It simply said, Thank you for fixing the mansion. It's part of our neighborhood again. Signed, in pencil, by a neighbor's kid. The kind of letter that actually means something. I smiled, folded it neatly, and tucked it into the same folder where Karen's eviction letter still sat. Funny? I murmured to myself as I went back to sanding the porch railing. How the right letter can change everything too. In the weeks that followed the meltdown, the neighborhood seemed to exhale. Not metaphorically, literally. People walked slower. Cars drove quieter. Conversations lasted longer than a stiff nod. Even the squirrels, who had previously sprinted across the park like they were being chased by suburban demons, now lounged on branches like they had a lease. The shift was subtle at first, like someone had adjusted the brightness and contrast on everyday life without telling anyone. But it was real, tangible, and it all began the day after the HOA signed that rental agreement. The HOA board members, now led by a man named Frank, whose entire personality was built around apologizing for other people's mistakes, made a point of approaching me one afternoon. I was repainting a set of windows, trying to match the exact antique green shade that must have looked regal sometime around 1870. When Frank trudged up the walkway with 2 other board members flanking him like bodyguards made of gilt. "We just want to say," he began, rubbing the back of his neck, "we're sorry for, everything." The woman beside him added, "It wasn't fair what Karen put you through." The third nodded vigorously. "She fined me once because my recycling bin was emotionally askew." "I get it," I chuckled. "All water under the bridge, folks. I'm just glad we can all get back to normal." Frank grimaced. "Well, about that, normal might take a bit. We had to cancel the next 3 HOA meetings. Everyone's too shaken." "Shaken?" I echoed. He shrugged. "Karen resigned in dramatic fashion. Rumor is she tried starting a splinter HOA behind the grocery store, holding meetings in the frozen foods aisle." I opened my mouth, then closed it. "You're kidding." Frank shook his head sadly. "She tried to issue a citation to someone buying off-brand waffles." I thought for a moment, then nodded. "Checks out." For the first time since I'd moved in, the board members actually laughed. Openly, without fear of being overheard. It was a strange sound, like a group rediscovering they had lungs. As they walked away, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. The air felt lighter without Karen prowling the neighborhood, looking for spiritual violations or emotionally charged landscaping crimes. And without her constant hovering, the park behind my house, the park that was now legally and officially my land, took on a whole new life. Parents stopped by with kids, asking politely if it was still okay to use the swings. Joggers paused to say thank you for keeping the place safe and open. One older woman even brought over a tray of cookies, explaining that she felt guilty for staying quiet during the whole fiasco. "Karen scares me," she confessed. "She once yelled at me because my garden gnome didn't express community values." "I'm not sure any gnome does," I said, taking a cookie. She smiled for the first time in what looked like a long while. After that, visits became common. People finally began treating me not as the mysterious squatter in the mansion, but as a neighbor, a real member of the community, a man who, in their eyes, had survived Karen and therefore could survive absolutely anything. But the biggest change wasn't in them. It was in me. When I first bought that mansion, I imagined a quiet retirement project. Just me and a century and a half of old lumber, creaky staircases, and the ghosts of questionable wallpaper choices. Instead, I found myself knee-deep in a suburban power struggle, forced to learn more about boundary lines and park liability laws than any retired mechanic ever should. Yet somewhere in the chaos, between the police visits, HOA hearings, spiritual land claims, and camera crews with newsish shirts, I rediscovered something I didn't realize I'd lost. The odd, unexpected humor of being part of a community. It wasn't the kind of humor you laugh at right away. It was the kind that sneaks in gradually, like watching a flock of ducks struggling to cross a road but still rooting for them anyway. It was the humor of seeing your neighbors not as extras in your quiet life but as characters with quirks, flaws, stories, and in some cases very questionable leadership tendencies. The mansion restoration continued, and every day brought some small victory. A repaired window, polished banister, a freshly reinforced beam. Each project made the house feel a little more alive, a little more ready to stand tall for another century. And yet the neighborhood seemed just as eager to rebuild itself. Without Karen at the helm, the HOA meetings became shorter, blessedly shorter. Instead of 3-hour tirades about trash cans exhibiting rebellious energy, meetings focused on things that actually mattered. Potholes, fencing, lost pets, whether the community barbecue should switch to a potluck system. More than once, neighbors stopped me to share their own HOA horror stories. One time she fined me because my welcome mat was sarcastic, someone said. Karen wrote me up because my mailbox looked like it lacked confidence, another whispered. I once got a warning for having a garden hose placed in a threatening manner. An elderly man revealed, eyes still wide. It occurred to me that everyone here had been living under a low-grade state of dictatorship, one that nobody had voted for but everyone had somehow tolerated. And all it took was one mansion, one retired mechanic, and one grossly misinterpreted property line to bring the whole thing to an end. But the real turning point, the moment my new life clicked fully into place, happened one afternoon while I was sweeping dust from the front steps. A group of neighborhood kids came running up the driveway, waving something in the air. "Mr. M," one shouted. "Can we show you something?" The tallest boy handed me a hand-drawn picture of the mansion. The details were surprisingly accurate. The old columns, the slanted shutters, even the big oak tree stretching across the yard. But right in the middle of the drawing was a little scribbled park with stick figures swinging, laughing, playing. Underneath, written in uneven letters, were the words, "Thanks for keeping our place safe." I stared at it longer than I intended. "That's quite the masterpiece," I finally said. The kids grinned with the pride of artists displaying their first gallery piece. "We're gonna put it on the community board," the smallest one said. "Yeah," another added, "where the old HOA warnings used to go. Mom says it's better for the neighborhood's blood pressure," the first boy said. I laughed. "Good idea." They ran off, leaving me with the drawing in my hands and an odd, warm feeling swelling in my chest. Not the dramatic movie kind of warmth, just the simple, comforting kind that tells you you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the sprinklers clicked on again with their familiar rhythm, I sat on my newly restored porch and watched the shadows stretch across the yard. Life felt still again. Quiet, steady, peaceful. But this time not isolated. Not empty. Just balanced. The mansion stood stronger than before. The neighborhood kinder. The park safer. The HOA calmer. And sure, conflict would come again someday. Suburbs are predictable that way. Just last week, someone down the street got fined for having a pink flamingo. And the week before that, a neighbor was warned about leaving a lawn chair out overnight. But those were minor storms. Little pockets of drama in an otherwise calm world. Nothing like the hurricane that had blown through my front yard. I looked out at the street, at the families settling into their evening routines, at the faint laughter drifting from the park, and felt the kind of contentment that never announces itself loudly. It just sits beside you quietly and lets you breathe. And I realized something as I watched the porch lights flicker on. One by one, up and down Willow Creek Drive. If your HOA ever sends you a letter like the ones I got, remember this: you can't control the petty, but you can absolutely outsmart it. And sometimes, without meaning to, you might just help a whole neighborhood breathe again.